Someone wants me to go more in depth on justification by faith alone in the church fathers. Yeah, I actually have. So I did a podcast on justification in the church fathers, and that was also part of the justification course that I taught at the Widener Institute, which you can purchase still. If you go to justincenter.org, you can purchase the course I taught on justification. And in that course, I do spend one of those evenings that we did on the topic of the church fathers and justification. I interact with this in my first book, The Righteousness of One. And so the question is specifically kind of maybe the later fathers, because I did do a podcast on Sola Fide and the church fathers, and I delved into mostly the apostolic fathers and some of the earlier figures. And they've also made the argument that people like Ambrose and Chrysostom can be seen as kind of precursors in a way to the Reformation approach to justification, though to make, I think, probably an exact equation between those two things, to say they're synonymous in every way, is probably not quite accurate, though I think all of the basic elements of what is the Reformational understanding of justification can be found in the Fathers. So yeah, I would say stay tuned. I am going to be doing another podcast on that. So I've done two. And I think only the first one is a video on YouTube. The other was just an audio podcast, which was on Ambrose and I think Chrysostom. I know I had some things planned there, but I don't know if I actually got into it. So anyway, stay tuned. There will be more on that issue. And related to that, there's a question here, which I'm also often asked about, is in terms of the kind of early church heritage of the Reformation, and in terms of continuity between the early church and the Reformation. One of the questions that's often raised is, do the solas of the Reformation, some of those great phrases or slogans that kind of define much of the theology of the Reformation, though honestly it is a bit simplistic, I think, sometimes when we boil everything down to the solas. And but anyway, so one of those is the question of, yeah, Sola Scriptura. So I have made the argument that we can find Sola Fide within the Fathers. And so the other question, can we find Sola Scriptura in the Fathers? And I would say yes. And a lot of it depends on how you define Sola Scriptura, and a lot of it depends on exactly what you're looking for. But what I would say is, when you look at the earliest controversies in the church, and you look at things like, Athanasius's debate with the Arians, I think you can ask the question, functionally, what is their authority? What is their primary authority? And then you can also ask the question, does tradition play the same role in those debates as it does in the later developed Roman view of church tradition? Does the papacy, does the Bishop of Rome have the same role in determining what is true, what is the belief of the church as in the early church as he does later? And I would say on both of those points, the answer is very clearly no. I think when you look at someone like Athanasius, it's apparent that the authority that he is pointing to above anything else is in fact Scripture. And you see this, I think, throughout the entire early church. It's really not to the Middle Ages that you have some more particular debates happening about exactly what are the streams and sources of authority. You can see this in Jaroslav Pelikan. He has a great book on tradition, but that he also has his book series on the history of Christian thought. And if you look at his medieval work, the series that's delving into the development of medieval theology, he has a good treatment of this in terms of what some of those original debates were. But what is very clear, even in those medieval debates, is that it's not like the question had been very settled. Okay, it's not that there was just a complete affirmation that tradition and Scripture both had some equal kind of value in terms of authority. It's something that does develop over time. And functionally, when you see the early church, I would say they do function on a sola scriptura basis in terms of the doctrine that they accept. But of course, I think that there is a difference then between how that kind of sola scriptura would function and the way that maybe a sola scriptura would function in a lot of contemporary evangelicalism, which is, very much historically naive or doesn't really have any role for history or hierarchy in the church to have any particular important function at all. So something like the regulative principle of worship, which even in the Reformed approach to Sola Scriptura would be really essential, we don't see that in the early church. There does clearly seem to be and not just seem to be, I would say there is an acceptance of tradition in terms of the developing aspects of a worship service, as well as in church hierarchy and structure. So what I would do is make a difference. I would make a distinction between those things which are the doctrines of the faith. And I would say, yes, functionally, the church holds to a kind of sola scriptura principle in the early church, though they're not going to use that language, of course, in terms of what determines the doctrines of the faith. But when it comes to the exclusivity of Scripture in forming what is the order of a worship service and what are the particulars of church hierarchy, the church does not adopt the same kind of sola scriptura principle that you'd find in either an Anabaptist or, in my view, a Reformed perspective. So I don't see that. You see bishops right away. There's a hierarchical structure that is developing. The other question, though, is, does that mean that the early church thought that those things were necessary, or that Scripture simply allowed freedom in the church to form itself how it desired to form itself, and form worship how it desired to form worship, so that Scripture doesn't demand one particular model of doing these things, which has been definitely been the Lutheran approach to this as well. So yeah, there's my brief comments in terms of how I think sola scriptura functioned in the early church. So I would say yes, that there was a belief in sola scriptura in the early church, that they don't formulate it in a historical vacuum or without also having a lot of attention to the hierarchy of the church councils, as well as fathers who came before them. But when it comes down to what determines our doctrine, I don't see the fathers grabbing onto anything other than Scripture itself as the foundational source and authority in terms of doctrine and teaching. So, we'd have to get more into that, and perhaps that is something for a future podcast and program to get into, in terms of the relationship between Scripture and tradition and how you can see sola scriptura in the early fathers. But we'll leave that for another time.